So, as I said, my name is Marcus from MS Lighting Design. I'm doing a series of webinars at the moment, and we are trying to cover topics which I find are quite interesting. I think these are areas which people often fall down on. They have trouble with various projects because of this. And so what I wanted to do is try and talk through and come up with some suggestions, what people can do to help make their lives easier, help try and deliver this within projects. So last week we talked about the new changes in regulations and what's going to be happening with carbon net zero, and that video will be going up soon online. But then this week I thought I'd talk about lighting controls. Now, often lighting controls is something that might not be covered by the lighting designer. They don't get maybe that involved. They don't do the specification of it. That can be left up to AV consultants or other people within the project. M&E consultants could be in charge of doing the lighting control. But as a lighting designer, I feel that it's in our interest to try and take control of this and make sure that it's done properly. There's a lot of effects that this has on projects. If you don't get the lighting controls wrong, the lighting can look terrible. So why do we need lighting control? Why do we want to have good lighting control over projects, over the lighting within the space? There's a lot of reasons why we might want to have good lighting control, but really this is what shows people how light looks within a space. Lighting is very subconscious. It transforms a space, it affects the way we feel, how we feel within a space. It can affect how we view, how we behave within that space, but it's all very subconscious. Whereas with lighting control, when people see that movement, when they see the transition to different kinds of settings, then lighting control is what allows people to bring that into the conscious. We've all had an experience within a restaurant where over time the lights have changed and suddenly the whole mood feels different. The lights have got lower, it feels more intimate, it feels different. That's what lighting control can do. It helps really change and show how dynamic lighting can be within a space. So, oh, sorry, I've got some problems with the audio. Let me see if I can sort that out. Hold on one moment. Okay, is this much better? You got better audio now? Can everyone hear me? Fantastic. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Right, so I was saying lighting control can be very dynamic. It can change the way people feel. It can change the way they behave within the space. And it is a very subconscious thing. So with lighting control, what we're doing is we're bringing that into the forefront. We're bringing that into the conscious mind, seeing how people actually they realize that there is lighting, there is interesting lighting within the space. And I was saying, for example, which we've probably all experienced, is a restaurant. If you have a restaurant and the lighting changes, you see that transition, you see a more intimate lighting within that space, and it looks very different. So what I wanted to do, I've got a couple of examples as well of how different lighting can make everything feel within a space. So these are a couple of examples of videos where I've shown the transitions of lighting. The first one was actually a presentation by Igazini in Light and Build, and it's very simple. It's showing off a new range of spotlights that they had, but I thought this really demonstrated what lighting control, it can be quite magical. So this one. I really like that example. I like that it shows a spotlight, and they talk about the fittings and the quality of fittings, and it is a very good fitting, but the different effects coming on at different times really shows the transition, and it makes it makes people aware of what that light pattern is doing. I have an example as well of a project where we have the different transitions that we go through, the different settings that we created for this client within their home. And sometimes it helps just to see that going through those transitions, the different settings we've created for it. You can see it changes the way it feels, the way it looks, and how it behaves within that space. And I think that is really the magic that people are looking for. They want to have that change, that transition, that difference within their home, within the spaces that they're creating, whether or not you're doing a restaurant or a hotel, doing a home, but it can be anywhere. So I think this really shows off what lighting and lighting control can do. And it's inherently important that the lighting control behaves the way it needs to. Now, for me, when I'm looking at lighting controls, there are two objectives, which I'm looking for the design on it. First is simplicity. Anytime we're doing lighting controls, we always sit there and we look at how simple we can make it for the client. How can we make it easy for them? How can we make sure that they are getting the best experience and we're making their lives easier? Okay, there's no point putting in lighting controls if it's going to be overly complex, because it won't get used. Often this could be a case that, can we do it with conventional switches? Do we need lighting controls, something sophisticated, or can we get away with something simple? We don't need to always have big complicated control systems. Sometimes we want to just keep it as simple as possible. So we're always trying to be quite reductive. We're trying to make sure that it is as easy as possible for the client. And having a conventional switch or a conventional dimmer is very simple. Everyone understands how to use that. They are inherently able to use that. And so if we can do it that way, that's the way we'll go. There's no point going and putting in big sophisticated controls if it's excessive. So if we can make it simple, then that's what we want to do. The next important part is having tailored control. It's got to be tailored to the space. It's got to work within that space. I often see people putting in systems, they're putting in a standard keypad, standard set of settings, they're making it basic, they're just keeping the same repetitive thing throughout. And sometimes it's too much. Often I've seen controls designed where there might be a little downstairs loo, the whole house is on a control system, and for some reason they have 4 different scenes for this loo. And there's really no reason for that. It should be as simple as possible. It's got to be tailored to the space. So looking at that space, how can you make it simple? And what do you want to have happen within each of the different areas? There's no generic way to say, this is the way we have it the whole way through, and that's it. Okay, so much like lighting design needs to be tailored, the actual lighting control needs to be tailored to the project as well. There's no such thing as a generic system, which is a one-size-fits-all for everything. So if those are what we're trying to achieve on every project, how do we go about doing that? And so what we want to look at is design philosophy. And the key thing with the design philosophy is we want the client to understand how to use it. All of this, the whole point of this lighting control is delivering something for a client. We want them to be able to use the lighting within a space. We want them to easily access it, not to get frustrated with it. What we don't want is a lot of people standing around, or the client standing around going, I have no idea how this system works, because then they're going to be frustrated, they're going to be angry and upset, and they're going to think, why have I spent all this money on a control system? So I think it's really important to bear in mind, and we always, I know it sounds very obvious, but we always have the focus on the client. How's the client going to use this? Now, I think a lot of people get caught up where they're going to have control systems. They might be specified by an AV consultant. So there's lighting control is one element of what they're providing. There's going to be audio visual, there's going to be alarm systems, sound systems, there's going to be fire control, AC, heating. This lighting is one section of that. And it's often easy to forget that lighting's there. And also what you have is clients come to you saying, I want this. I want some fancy technical stuff. I want to have these fancy systems. They might have seen it somewhere else. They think, right, well, I'm building my dream home. This is what I want to have. And they start thinking about this. But what I like to think about, as I'm a bit of a techie myself, it's very easy for me, coming from an engineering background, to look at technology, adapt and understand it. And I take a great interest in that. So I would regard myself as quite early on a scale of sort of early adopters and innovators. I like to get in there. I like to play with technology. But what we need to understand is the majority of people are not in that range. The majority of people do not want to play around. They do not want to read manuals. They don't want to have to understand how a system works. They just want it to work. And so the majority of people are later on this design curve and adoption curve. So what we really need to do is just keep it as simple as possible. And we've often got to think of it not as a case of, this is how it works, here you go, here are the instructions. It's got to be effortless. I think Steve Jobs did a great job of this. He was always talked about saying that you shouldn't have to read a manual. It should be inherently understood how things are going to work. And they had huge success at Apple because of that, because people could just use the products and start working with a phone, making it understood. It's very easy and simple to use. And I think that's one thing that can be missing from a lot of lighting controls. Now, I'm going to go through some of the key points when we're designing, what we consider, what we think is important. I know there's probably quite a few AV people and lighting control people here. I might offend some of you because I'm going to say certain things. I have had a lot of bad experiences with AV companies. I'm not saying they're all like this. So there might be certain things I say. Hopefully you understand. I'm just trying to help and sort of impart some knowledge and show what really the other side are thinking about when it comes to this. So the first thing which I'd like to point out is, or I'd like to highlight, is that light leads controls. Light and the lighting design has to come first. You can't design a control system properly without having a lighting scheme. And it's very much a case of putting horse before the cart if you're trying to do that. Now, I often have clients who've already contacted AV consultants. They have had some design work done on that because they've thought about that first. They haven't thought about the lighting design. It hasn't come into their mind. When they're thinking about, I want a smart home system, they think, right, okay, get a smart home system, audio visual, lighting control gets put into that. And I've come onto projects where they have specified a lighting control system and there is no lighting scheme. And you can't do that. The problem is, it might be a case that you're trying to give an estimate, a ballpark figure, but it just doesn't work. What happens is you define it to the client before any lighting control system comes in there. And then what you have is either two outcomes, because the system is going to be incorrect. There are going to have to be changes once the lighting design has been done. And so it's either going to be an additional cost. So there's going to be an added cost onto that project. Suddenly the lighting control system might jump up by 50% in cost because an estimate's been put in and suddenly there's a huge jump because they've had a lighting design done. It's become quite sophisticated because that's what the client wants. And then suddenly there's this huge additional cost, which is not nice to the client. They don't like to get ambushed with all these costs. What that can mean is either they've got to pay a lot more money, or what you're going to have is the lighting scheme will get compromised. And at that point, you have a real problem because what you've got is a lighting scheme which is getting torn apart and trying to shoehorn it into a control system which wasn't even designed for it. Then the lighting doesn't happen properly. You don't have that magic of the transitions, of the different settings, of the layers of light, of the moods and the scenes. And really at that point, you're ruining the experience for the client. So the first thing is that the light should lead controls, and that really it shouldn't be specified before a lighting scheme has been put together. And that should be a push to request and make sure that that lighting scheme is agreed beforehand, before you start getting control specifications. It can cause just so many issues. And we've had a number of projects where something has been specified and then suddenly it's not right. We've had pressure from clients, restaurant owners and everything, where they're like, well, we don't want to pay this extra cost. How can we make it work? And the lighting scheme has ended up being compromised and they've regretted it afterwards. But afterwards, there's nothing you can do because it's already wired. You can't go back and change it. So that's the first thing I would say, is you've got to have that lighting scheme in place. Next, I often think about whole life design. We work for clients, we're independent lighting designers, where they're working for them, looking after their interests and projects. And we look at it as very much what's going to happen after we leave. What is the client getting after we've stopped work, after the project is finished, after the build is finished? And this can be a challenge. There are a lot of elements that you have to factor in. We're trying to look at the whole life of this control system all the way until the property and the client, the property is sold and the client moves away, or until it's completely renovated again. And there's a lot of things to consider. First of all, we have to consider who's going to set up the system. After it's installed, who's going to do the commissioning? Who's going to make sure that it's all working? How's that going to go through? And I'll come on to the commissioning later on, because that is quite a detailed area that you really need to pay attention to. But then who's going to maintain the system? After everyone's left, who's going to come in? How's the client going to know how to maintain the system? Who's going to tell them what they've got to do? Who do they call? Have they got a point of contact? Do they understand what they've got to do? Does an engineer have to come in often to attend? How often is a commissioning engineer for that control system going to have to come along? Are they going to have to come along every time an adjustment is wanted? And does the client understand the additional cost that that's going to have? We've had projects where other members of the design team or the contractors have suggested that we go with alternative systems, generally for budget reasons, and they don't factor in that this might result in huge extra costs to the client after they've left. They're looking at it in a short-term point of view. They're looking at, let's get a system done, fitted, it's done, and after that, we're off the job, it doesn't matter. It's almost the client's problem at that point. And I don't think we're really advising clients properly if we're doing that. We should really be telling clients about the whole system, about the whole life, about how you're going to maintain it, how you're going to look after that system after it's installed. How often does an engineer need to come in? We had a project in the last couple of years, which was an airport lounge, and the M&E consultant wanted us to specify everything as DALI dimmable, because then they could specify a control system which uses DALI lighting, DALI control over it. They can simplify it, they can make it easier and cheaper to install, because the contractors were quite happy running DALI cabling. It means less cables needed to be run, makes everything easier and quicker. And I had to push back on this because we had some issues with how that was going to be maintained. We didn't have any building management team on site. There was going to be a handyman who could come out and do a little bit of work, but they would not understand DALI. And if we had faults with some of the DALI equipment, it would mean that the system would need to be recommissioned and those elements would need to be added back into the lighting controls. When you have DALI, if you have to remove drivers and replace them, sometimes you have to reprogram them into the system, which in theory, that could just be factored into the maintenance. But the problem was this was an airport lounge. So you'd have to wait 3 days for an electrician to get passed through security and come and maintain it. At that point, they might not know what the issue is. They come out on site. Then you have to wait another 3 days for the commissioning engineer. and the electrician to come back with the right equipment to set it all up. They might need someone else there to come on site. They might need us to come back on site and guide them through all of this. So what might have been a £100 call out charge elsewhere was actually going to be £1,500 to £2,000 in costs, plus over a week in delays in getting that lighting back up and running. And if it was in a critical area, then that space might not even work. They might not be able to open, so they're losing a huge amount of revenue. So our solution was to push back and do simple controls within this space, simple dimming types within there, so that the maintenance man could actually change that over and it wouldn't need any recommissioning. So it's very much looking at the whole life. How are you going to factor that in? How are you going to make sure that it's easy to maintain and it actually functions? Because what would be worse than the cost is that it's not going to get fixed and people leave it, and then the space looks terrible after that, and the client isn't getting that design which they wanted within that space. So it's very much a case of looking at the whole life of the design. Next, we come on to simplicity. Now, we talked about this earlier on. It's got to be simple. It's got to be easy for the client to use. And so often that doesn't happen. Now, with us, when we're looking at designs, we're looking at how to create a scheme. How are we going to do the lighting control within the space? We almost always, in most areas, come down to needing 3 settings. We have a bright setting, a relaxed setting, and a night setting. In smaller rooms, it might be even less than this. It might be 2 settings. This is simple. We don't want a keypad with 10, 15 buttons on it. We don't want anything which is overly complex. We don't want to have lots of different controls and lots of different settings. What people want is effortless control when they come into a space. They want to be able to walk in there. If you wanted complicated control, you could stick with normal dimmer switches. You could put 10 dimmer switches on the wall and come in. What's the client going to do if they have that? They just slap them all on together. They're just going to turn everything on and it's all going to be bright. It's all not going to give them those transitions and the effortlessness that they need. So the same goes with lighting scenes. We don't want 10 settings. We don't want lots of buttons on the wall. We want it simple. We have wonderful technology that if we have occasional settings that we want to access, we can do that via a touch screen or a phone. We don't need to have it on a wall switch there. So almost all our designs that end up with this kind of setting. If it's an open plan space, we might have 1 or 2 more, but it's got to be as easy as possible. It's got to be simple. And generally that's what we end up having in most of our designs. What we also do is we take a couple of principles to run through that. So we always design our settings so that the top button is always the bright setting, and then you transition down through those different settings from bright to lower levels. That way it's intuitive for the client to understand how to go through those different settings. They know whichever room they walk into, press a button, it turns the lights on. If they're at the top of the switch, they're going to get bright settings. If they want low, they can press the bottom settings. What they actually get will vary depending on the type of room it is, but the main thing is that you've got a theme running through the design. And it's very much a case of trying to keep those same control principles throughout. When we do these kinds of settings on our systems, we generally make it so it's a toggle switch, so that when you press the button, it turns on. If the client then presses it again, it turns them off. So much like a conventional switch at home, press it on, press it off. People understand that. If you get guests coming over who are trying to use it, they can press it and they can press it again. They switch the lights off. They don't need to worry about complex controls and it being difficult to use and having to hunt for the right button. It's got to be so easy. It's got to be simple throughout. And this isn't just for lighting control. This can be for shade control as well. If you're going to choose a way to control your shades, if you're going to have an up and down button, then do that the whole way through. If you're just going to have it on one button which starts and stops the shade in different directions, do that the whole way through the property. Make it as easy as possible to have those transitions. If you can also automate all of this. If you're doing a hospitality project, you can make sure that all of this is set up and then changes at set times. And so that you're removing any problems, anyone not knowing how to use that space. Finally, I want to touch on touchscreens. We have a lot of touchscreen controls out there. There's phones, tablets, wall-mounted controls. Almost every lighting control company can provide you with these kinds of controls. There are sophisticated whole home solutions. They almost all have touchscreens where you can interact with them. This is not appropriate to replace a switch in a room. When people walk into a room, they demand light straight away. It has to be instant. It's not like heating control where if a room is a little bit cold, people won't notice for half an hour or an hour, or if it's a bit warm, they won't notice for that time. People notice light very quickly and the lack of light very quickly. You can't walk into a room and then have to look at a touch screen and go through 3 or 4 different menus to get to a button which turns on the lighting. It doesn't work that way. In my view, and the way I've seen with clients, the only time people want to use touchscreens are when they want to have a play around and they've got time. They never want to use it for the normal control. So they can't replace switches with touchscreens. Generally, my clients only end up playing with this when they want to make adjustments, when they want to tweak and make changes to the settings which are within the system. So if it's in a commercial property, they will be using a touchscreen to make adjustments. They're never going to use it at any other time. If it's in a residential property, only time clients are going to use touchscreens is when they're sitting on the sofa or when they're in bed and they've got their phone out and they're playing around and they're pressing different settings because they're almost bored. They just want to do something, want to fiddle with something. They're not going to use it at any other time, definitely not when they're moving through a space and they need to turn lights on. So you can't have a touchscreen switch instead of a conventional switch. You have to have conventional on-off switches which will allow you to turn lights on as soon as you walk into that space, and then you can have touchscreens to go and make adjustments and play with it. And I think that's really important. I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of glass switches, of ones where there are not actual physical buttons to press. I think people need a tactile switch to be able to press them on. If you think about your lights at home, when you walk into a space, you go to a switch and you press a button, you probably don't look at the switch. You just reach out and you touch and you feel where it is and you turn it on and off. If you have no buttons on there, if it's a glass plate, you're not going to be able to do that. I mean, that is a design preference. I think that's much easier for clients to use. Depends on the client though, but I think you've got to actually have a physical button to press. So that is simplicity. It's about keeping it as simple as possible. And finally, we're going to come on to commissioning. You know, I think commissioning is critical to a space. Making sure that you have a system properly commissioned makes or breaks a project. But so often it's forgotten. So, I mean, I don't want to offend any AV companies, but I often find that towards an end of a project, they've already sold most of the system, a commissioning engineer is sent out, they do a basic setup, and that's it. And it's not properly done. A number of times I've had clients come to me and they've had lighting control systems before and they say, I don't want it again. It was useless. It never did what I wanted it to do. And it's not that there's something wrong with that lighting control system. Most of the lighting control systems out there are very good and are able to do whatever we want them to do. It just hasn't been commissioned properly. No one has taken the time over the commissioning to set it up properly. So when we're looking at a project, we often specify we're going to need a minimum of 3 visits from a commissioning engineer. And so the first visit is the initial setup. This is getting the system up and running, making sure it's all functioning. It happens around second fix. So you should be coming out and doing that, making sure it all runs properly before the end of the project, but ideally after the lighting has been installed. That can be quite tricky to line that up. It might need to be split into 2 visits, depending on how the system is designed and how it's going to be set up within a room and how the project and the program is running. But it needs to be done. So the commissioning engineer can come along, work with the electrical contractor, make sure any problems and bugs are fixed. Maybe do some basic settings so that you can walk into a room, turn things on and off, but not done for scenes. Second visit is scene setup. So this is ideally after the property is furnished. So you've got furniture in there, you know where things are going, and you can then set it all up within that space. Now, this ideally is done before the client moves in. Often there's a big rush at that point to come in there and do scene setup, do that commissioning engineering, setup of all those light settings. Sometimes the client wants to move in straight away. Really, it's like soft furnishing. We do need to take a bit of time to do that on site before that setup. Third visit is adjustment. So after that initial scene setup, you want to be coming back after the project is finished 2 to 6 months later to make sure that it's all right. Allow the client to use it for a while, make sure that it's functioning properly, and then come back and provide adjustments. Now, this all sounds very obvious, but a lot of the time the client doesn't know this. They're not experts. They don't understand how this all works. And it's very important that someone is telling them that this is an option. Often they don't see it as an option. They don't know that this should be happening. What they'll see is a system which isn't working, isn't done. They don't understand that they need to have input, that other people need to do this sort of stuff. So in my mind, interior designer, architect, lighting designer, whoever's in charge of this, or even as a group, should be present for the second and third visit. And ideally, the client is there for the second and third visit as well. They're going to have input. They're going to have ideas. And it's really important that this is done. Often just asking the question, right, are you happy? Do you want changes? Going through this space with everyone and making sure that they understand it, that they know how it's going to work, that there are these options, that you can do changes, presenting it to the client. Also presenting the scenes. We do lighting commissioning at the end of projects. We work with AV consultants, with the people providing the lighting controls, the commissioning engineers. We go around, we do the setup, we adjust the lighting, then we take the client through it. We explain to them what we've created. Are you happy with this? Do you want to tweak it? Do you want to put it up and down? Do you understand how it works? And that way, guiding them through it is really important. So this is what makes or breaks a project. If you don't have commissioning done properly, then you're going to have a big problem. And really, the onus should be on whoever's providing the lighting control system. If you've installed and sold a lighting control system, they should be going back to the client, making sure that they understand. But sometimes that doesn't happen. So architects, interior designers, lighting designers can do this as well. We can go in there, make sure this is going to get set up properly. But the thing we can't do is just leave it for a client. We can't just leave them and expect them to ask for it. And I think this is so important. So when I teach interior design students, I tell them that this is so important. The reason for anyone who's involved in the design of these systems is if the system isn't working properly, then our designs do not look good. I know my lighting design will look terrible if the lighting controls are not functioning properly. I want to create different moods and atmospheres, create different scenes within that space. And if the lighting controls don't function right, it's not the lighting controls, it's just going to be a case, oh, it's a bad lighting scheme. That lighting designer didn't do anything. It doesn't work. The magic is in having those transitions, having the ability to change how a space feels. And so I think it's really, really important that this gets set up properly, and it can really make or break a project if this isn't done. So insisting on good commissioning, making sure that this gets followed through is what is going to transform a project. So that was what I wanted to do. That was my last point. And I think this is really the key point. If you're going to take anything away from this, make sure the commissioning gets done properly at the end. Because often most lighting control systems can all do everything. They can all dim lighting, they can create scenes, they can do different functions. But if you don't have the commission done right, it's not going to work properly. So just wanted to say thank you to everyone. If anyone has any questions, they can put it in the chat and I will try and answer them in a minute. We'll do a little Q&A session at the end. But thank you very much for attending this webinar, which I've hosted. We do have some other webinars coming up, some presentations next week on Thursday. It's all Thursday at 10 a.m. But we're going to do lighting basics. We're going to talk about color rendering and we're going to talk about color temperature. We're going to cover as much as possible on those topics and try and give people an understanding of why this is important, how it affects projects, and help out when you're doing these specifications. I'm going to do an open Q&A on the 23rd of April. I will be here for half an hour. People can throw questions at me, anything they want answered. Hopefully I'll be able to help out. And then on the 30th of April, we will host another one. I haven't decided on a topic yet for that one, but we'll be sending out an email with that. So thank you very much to everyone. And I hope you all have a great day. I'm going to answer some questions. So Jack Martin has asked, who would you consider to be the best person to design lighting controls? I don't think there's anyone who would be best to design lighting controls. I find it easy to design lighting controls myself because I already know the lighting scheme. I know how I want to achieve it. I think if you have a lighting designer, they should have an input into how it's going to function at the end. And so, for example, how many settings you're going to have in each room, keypad specification is going to need input from a lighting designer or an architect. But actual design of lighting controls could be done by an M&E consultant. It could be done by a lighting designer. It could be done by an AV consultant. I think the key is to focus on actually getting it tailored to the lighting design. Definitely have a lighting design in place. I mean, I might be a bit biased, but I would love it if AV consultants just went back to their client and said, where's your lighting design? Where's your schedule? Because really that's what you should be getting on a job. You should be getting a load schedule, all the different circuits, guidance on how the lighting control should be done. And then an AV consultant can specify the lighting controls to match it. So in that way, I think it could be done by anyone, but it's a case of making sure you've got the information so you can properly specify it, rather than just trying to add it onto a whole house smart home control specification, trying to just put something in there as a placeholder. Have it actually done properly. Sandra has asked me, what systems do I like to use in houses? I'm not going to talk about specific lighting control brands. I do have preferences to certain types, but it is very much dependent on the project. And if a client has a preference to a different type of system, there are pros and cons of lots of different lighting control systems. And we really work with them. If they have a preferred type, then we'll work with that control system. I did say, and I do believe this, most lighting control systems out there can do whatever we want them to do. There are certain ones I prefer. Generally, when I'm looking at a lighting control system, there's going to be two factors that I'm going to look at. First is it reliable? The last thing we want is it to fall over when a client's using it. So is it reliable? Has it got some sort of distributed programming so there's no single point of failure in it? And then also we're looking at how easy is it to make adjustments? Can a client make adjustments themselves? Is that easy to do? Is it simple? And then at that point, that will help guide me when I'm trying to choose a control system. Jack has asked, do you think people mistake simple for basic? I think that, I mean, if you saw it written down, yes. I think when you're talking to a client, I think everyone wants things which are simple. It's very rare I get a client who says to me that they want to be able to do lots and lots of different settings. Almost all my clients tell me they don't want a fancy control system. We don't want it sophisticated. We don't want all these newfangled technologies in our home. We want it simple. We just want normal switches. By the time we've gone through the design process, they often are happy for us to specify a control because they understand that what we're doing is we are making their lives simpler. I think the key is to make the client's life simple. Lighting controls themselves, the technology is not simple. There's a lot of sophisticated technology. There's a lot of complicated engineering which goes into making a lighting control system work. The main thing is, at the end, is it easy for the client to use? If it isn't, then we failed. But I don't think people will think simple is basic. I think a lot of the time they would love to hear that something's going to be basic for them to use. If I could tell them, yes, this is going to be very simple, it's going to be very easy for you to use, that's what they want to hear. They do not want to be having to deal with complicated controls. Right. Andy has asked me, do I have a preference between hardwired buttons, between real hard buttons and the use of PIRs? I do actually like PIRs and sensors. I presented a paper a few years ago to the ILP where about a house which I designed so that the client didn't have to use a switch. We did the entire home on PIRs. We had a huge amount of conditional logic and programming behind it so that it functioned properly and transitioned to different times of the days. And I do think actually it's something that you could do. And I think that's probably where we're going to move towards in technology in the future. The issue you have is PIRs are not particularly great at doing that. And really, we should be using a different kind of technology. I think GUI have done some very interesting stuff with cameras and recognition of people moving through space on video. But then you have all the security concerns alongside that. But that could be very interesting in the future. I think what's an interesting question is, why do I need to press a switch every time I walk into a room? Why? I know I'm going to need light if there's no light in that room, so why do I have to press a switch? But it is very complicated to do. I mean, when I did the project with no switches in the house, it took 3 months to commission it. And with that client, I didn't say yes to doing it straight away. They asked me to do it. They very much pushed for it. And I made them wait a week and consider all the downfalls of it before we went ahead with the project. And they still wanted to go ahead knowing that it was probably going to be about that long to commission. But they were really eager to try and do it. Daniel has asked me, what's my opinion on homeowners having RGB color change in their homes? Color change is something that I think most lighting designers would say no to color change, to RGB. Though I actually believe a lot of lighting designers secretly harbor a love for some color. I think color is extremely complex to design with. I think color change, I hate the phrase color change because what it implies is that you're going to have changing colors all the time and it's going to look like a disco. And if I ever use color change lighting, it's often just to generate 1 or 2 specific colors that I know will work within the scheme. I think dealing with color is extremely complex. We already have enough complexity of different kinds of whites, and then you're going to add color into that. It is so difficult. We get people, sometimes people ask for it. I do currently have 2 projects ongoing where we've got color change and we've got disco balls. I haven't seen disco balls in a long time, but it is something that people do ask for. I guess you've got to allow it. The one thing I would always do alongside color change is providing good white. I would never have just color change lighting within a room. I'd have good white light as well. And we have to be able to generate good white light within that space. So then the RGB is an option within that space. Right, next question. Grant has asked, are wireless controls considered reliable, or is wired the only option? I do think wireless controls are an option. I think there are lots of different types out there. I think anything which is working on an 868 megahertz frequency, which is a protected frequency, is probably quite reliable. It is simple inherently because of the frequency and the restrictions around it and what data you can transmit. And I think wireless can be done quite well. The ongoing maintenance of that can be a concern. Sort of making sure client knows that batteries have to be changed. That's often sounds simple. If I have to choose, I go with wired, but sometimes wireless is a good option, especially for retrofit. And whenever we talk about lighting controls, I think we have to consider that there's a huge amount of housing stock in the world which you might be wanting to retrofit into, and wireless controls are going to be the only option to do that with. Fires has asked, so complicated, Fires has talked about complicated functions can come over time within a home as you live with it and you experience it, and creating more complicated functions as you go through. I think that's very true. And I think this is part of the reason why we want to stay engaged with clients, because it could be something you could propose after that third visit later on and say, look, if you're interested, maybe we can do this, but you've got to ease clients into it. There's no point trying to bombard them with all of this stuff early on. And so, as you say, I think it's something which has to come later on. Damien has asked about what's my view on Kasambi and similar advances for apps on phones, etc. I personally feel that Bluetooth is probably where lighting control is going to move to as far as a communication protocol. There's lots of different types out there. I have posted about this on LinkedIn and it became a bit controversial and lots of people arguing with me. The reason I think that's the case is, one, it's a proven technology which has international standards already. It has good security around it. And with the development of Bluetooth mesh, I think that that is going to get around some of the inherent problems that you have. Kasambi is a Bluetooth-based technology. I think that's going to be good. I think, personally, at the moment, the technology is not there yet. One of the major problems that you have is almost everything, all the ways the controls are done, the apps are all designed effectively by engineers for engineers. There is nothing simple about them. It's not easy to add components. I think Philips Hue has done a good job of doing this, but that's a very restricted closed system and it's not opened up to other manufacturers. You can't add different kinds of fittings into it. But everyone else, there is no easy to use app, which most people can pick up. And I think I would love for the lighting control community to go out there and get external user experience consultants in, because there's a lot to learn about how you interact with technology, how normal lay people will interact with technology, and having a good user experience design for it is going to be so important. And the first person who cracks that is the one who's going to become the biggest control system out there. I think Kasambi, as an environment, as a manufacturer, with what they've done with the OEM technology and the fact that they've created switch interfaces so you can have whatever switch you want within the space, is very good. And I'm excited, but it's way off from actually being usable in the future. Andrew has asked, what can a supplier of lighting do to make it easier for you to design, implement, control? Provide me all the different dimming types, please. If you're going to provide products, if lighting manufacturers want to help out, provide products with different dimming types, please. If I can't do it on 0 to 10 volt or on phase or on Dali, then it's going to create a barrier for me to specify products. So making it as easy as possible, providing a variety of different dimming types would be really good. Generally, all this requires is different drivers. Often I'm getting manufacturers, if they don't do it, but the client really wants some decorative fitting, we're going to take that and then I'm going to strip out the driver with the electrician and we're going to put a different driver in it if you don't provide it. But I don't want to be doing that, and it makes my life very difficult. Jack asked, do I think that Bluetooth will be surpassed by PoE when we adopt DC grid buildings? Well, I don't know. I don't know if we'll adopt DC grid buildings. I will probably be dead before that happens because it's going to take so long. The change in infrastructure is huge. I don't really think we're going to ever transition between the power distribution and the way that things are wired at the moment. I find it very, we deal mainly with residential. To give you an example, we've gone through a huge transition. Everything is now LED. LED hates phase dimming, and yet everything is still generally wired as twin and earth for conventional wiring as old-fashioned incandescent and halogen, and that hasn't changed, even with a complete movement and banning of all those light sources. It's because electricians do not want to wire any other way. They don't want to learn how to wire any other way. So I don't know if I can answer that question. I don't think it's relevant for me to answer it because I'll probably be dead by the time that actually happens. Any tips? Lewis asked for tips on starting lighting designing. Come along to the Q&A in 2 weeks' time. That's a big, deep question. Generally, there's not anywhere to start. It's exposing yourself to lots of different designs, looking at what other people are doing. Most lighting designers don't set out to be a lighting designer. They start somewhere else and then they come into it, but through architecture or interior design. But that's, yeah, it's quite a complicated question. I'd say come along to Q&A and ask me that and I'll go into it in detail. And I think that's all the questions. Oh no, hold on, did I miss something here? Paul Town has asked, what do you do to test mains dimming compatibility for lighting and controls? That is a very good and big question. What do? We buy a range of different LED lamps every 6 months to a year. Of ranges where they have the right color temperatures, the right beam angles. We also buy certain drivers, which will do constant current and constant voltage. And then we have a number of different dimmers and we test it all. And we manually do this in the office. And that's how we do our dimming compatibility testing. Beyond that, there's not much you can do. Whoever says their stuff is dimmable, half the time you can't trust them. It might not dim very well. It might not dim low enough. It might only dim to 20 or 30%. But we have to go through all of this. If it's something critical on a project, we'll get a sample. We'll test it on the dimmer, which we're proposing on the project. Sometimes we don't have that ability. Sometimes it's digging down and saying, is it mains dimmable? How is it mains dimmable? Is it leading or trailing edge, and going from there? It is a very difficult area. Ideally, I would like not to do too much mains dimming, but we still have to factor it in a lot of the time. But once we've got something reliable, we're probably going to stick with it. So there are certain lamps and drivers that we know work very well, and we keep using those. Thank you very much. Right, I think that's all the questions. Have a lovely Easter, everyone. Enjoy the break.